I'm James Day, and this is WorldComm. Did you ever stop to ask yourself what Quasimodo, Porky Pig, and Beavis and Butthead have in common? Well, probably not. They're all animated characters, products of the artist's pen and the complex process of turning drawings into live action. Most of us grew up thinking animated cartoons were just for kids. Not anymore, if in fact they ever were. In my day, Betty Boop's visual innuendos rattled censors as much as her live-action counterpart, Mae West. Unknown to me, however, were the propaganda shorts produced in top secret and shown in army barracks as part of soldiers' basic training. Today, shows like The Simpsons, King of the Hill, The Critic, The Legend of the Overfiend frequently deal in subjects that were once taboo even for adults: sex, rape, dysfunctional families, death, and alcoholism. No, it's not just for kids anymore. For this discussion of the current state of animation, we'll be joined shortly by John O'Donnell, who's Managing Director of Central Park Media, and Candy Kugel, who is a director and producer at Buzzco Associates, Incorporated. But first, I have some questions to put to our key witness, Don Duga. Don Duga is Vice President of Polestar Animation. We're going to talk with Don right after we look at this short film on the use of animation to promote the war effort.
In the early half of the century, the targeted audience for animated films was vaguely defined. As a result, the subjects addressed in animation ranged from juvenile sight gags to the current social topics. In AWOL, or All Wrong Old Laddiebuck, animation was used as a propaganda tool to discourage soldiers from deserting their posts in World War I. During their golden age, Warner Brothers Studios was capable of capturing the interest of both juvenile and adult audiences within the same episode. This was done with the reliable formula of visual gags for children.
Hello, baby. Hiya, Sussy. Say you're a nifty trick. I hope I meet some babes in Africa as cute as you are.
And sly pop culture references for grown-ups.
But I gotta get a move on now. I sail at 4:30. He's got to get a move on now. He sails at 4:30. Hey, the troopship bound for Africa pulls out at 4:30.
During the 40s, Warner Brothers and other studios were called on to produce witty and informative propaganda shorts for the United States Armed Forces.
They're gonna bomb us.
Shoot off your face. And baloney is flying all over the place.
in Germany.
Worst air raid of the war.
Yeah, they blasted hell out of Brooklyn Bridge. Coney Island was wiped out. What's the matter with our planes? They popped them off like kites.
Them parachute troops landed right on the White House lawn.
The Florida coast is lousy with invasion pods.
Among the most popular were the Private Snafu series. Snafu, the title character, was a lackadaisical infantry soldier whose overconfidence and gullibility gets him into situations far beyond his control.
I wish the hell you'd shut up. I ain't no boob and I won't be trapped. Hiya, Toots. What cooks? Something new has been added.
Snafu's misadventures illustrated for the boot camp audiences the grave need to observe military protocol in a humorous way.
Booby traps.
The 60s saw a transition of venues from the movie theater to the television screen. With this came the increased demand for more animation that could be produced rapidly and cheaply. These Saturday morning cartoons exhibited poor creative and technical quality, as well as an excess of formulaic visual gags and uninspired verbal humor. Often, the cartoons themselves became nothing more than 30-minute commercials for merchandising ploys. By the mid-'70s, animation was branded with the stigma of being a lowbrow art geared towards children alone.
Don Duga is our key witness. Don is the vice president of Polestar Animation. Is this the kind of thing that you do at Polestar?
Saturday morning? No. Though I am guilty of actually having participated in Saturday morning, and I know the workings of that kind of show. But,
Don, Saturday morning aside, when we think about children's animation, I guess the first name that pops into my head is Disney. Snow White up to Lion King and so forth. And yet, Disney couldn't make it if it were just for kids, could he? I mean, I think of these are not exactly kids' programs.
Yeah, well, that's I was just recently in California, and we were watching the outtakes in Snow White where the witch is brewing up. These skulls are coming out, and it's quite frightening scene. And it turns out that there was a letter written to Walt saying that even though this film, talking about Snow White, is not made for children, there might be children in the audience, so we think we ought to take the scene out.
So he did not think it was for children?
No, it was not designed for children. It was an adult film, Snow White was. And though I was affected as a child, it definitely affected me, but it was made for those that could pay for it.
I suppose we could say it was made for family audiences, because when we talk about some of the adult animation today, it's not for family audiences necessarily. It's truly for adults.
Yeah, I think that today it's definitely directed into other areas which have been kind of taboo. Like you talk about Saturday morning, the restrictions of what you could say and what you could do were very tight. I mean, you couldn't even have things flying into the screen because that.
Really?
There were a lot of things that people don't understand, but there were a lot of censorship in that. So they couldn't really do much.
Who exercised the censorship, Don? It wasn't the artists themselves. The networks?
Networks. Networks had definite demands on what had to be into those shows. The attempt to do something in prime time was long thought about, and back in the days that I was working with Rankin Bass, we did develop the Coneheads, which was designed for that audience. This is before The Simpsons, and we actually hired Al Franken and Tom Davis to write it, and got the whole crew of Jane Curtin and Lorraine Newman and Dan Aykroyd all together to do the voices, and it was an adult piece, but and we did the pilot.
I mean, as adult as Saturday Night Live is, I suppose.
Yes, it had that the same kind of humor that the Coneheads did, which was not, it was made for another audience.
What about the Flintstones? Isn't that's a primetime animated show, or was in its day?
Well, Flintstones was again, and I think Flintstones set the pace for what you call cheap-looking animation and recycled backgrounds and all the other things. And the reason was that they did it for extremely little money in those days that they made it, and they had to produce these things at a great demand. In Hollywood, we used to call it the sausage factory. You grind it out, and artists were working on it, but it wasn't very satisfying.
It was even a satire, was it not? Satire may not be the word, upon the honeymooners. That is, it was based more or less upon the honeymooners, so it wasn't original even in its storyline, so to speak.
Yeah, well, the animation is always great at parodying, taking off of something that has existed in life. When I think of animation for adults, I think of sophisticated animation, visually speaking. The Simpsons seems to me to be not sophisticated animation. Now, you as an animator will know better than I, but it seemed to be crude animation. Sophisticated content, but crude animation. Well, it was, if you look at the early episodes, it's extremely crude. It got better and better, and so they're...
Not because they learned how to do it,
but I think you're talking about the nature of doing a show, and there's a tremendous compression of deadline that we didn't have in the old days when we were making theatrical films. When I started when I started doing Magoo and working on Magoos, we had like 6 months to do one film. And then now to do a half-hour show, you have less than 6 months to produce it. So
Mr. Magoo was shown in theatrically then, was it?
yeah,
not?
theatrical. So theatricals. So the changeover when television came in, the deadline pressure. So you understand it's the media that had a lot to do with the way that things were affected by it. So that in fact, UPA did the first children's show, which was for CBS on television. It was the first time animation was used on television.
When was that?
Oh, that was back in 59.
Almost the beginning of television.
Yeah, yeah.
Don, we're going to break here for just a moment. Before we join our guests, we're going to take a brief look at the darker side of animation and how it's been used to portray racial stereotypes and sex and violence. This should be fun.
Yeah, I'm looking forward to that.
While Warner Brothers, MGM, and Disney provided classic and memorable animated features and shorts in the 30s and 40s, there's a hazier chapter to this vast library of animation they produced.
I wish I wasn't the king. Hooray! Hooray! Oh, can
Racial stereotyping was a common practice among the studios to win some cheap laughs from their audiences. German, Jewish, and Italian characters were fairly frequent in these shorts. But no minorities were assaulted as relentlessly as the Japanese and the African American. The African American was often portrayed as slovenly and superstitious, with a distinct appetite for gambling and watermelons.
You take that.
Take, for example, this excerpt of Half Pint Pygmy from MGM Studios. During World War II, the Japanese were depicted as buck-toothed, slant-eyed fanatics who spoke in a garbled cackle rather than a distinct language.
To demonstrate how to constructing the delicious Japanese club sandwich. Rice bread ration card, 4. A praise a piece of a meat ration card, 4. Then eat them. Oh, yum yum sandwich. After eating, you are enjoying a club.
During the 60s, as minorities within America grew more empowered and alert to their portrayals in the media, the major studios quietly shelved these works. Or if there was only a single scene that ridiculed a particular minority, an alert viewer may have noticed the offensive scene discreetly removed from future broadcasts. Sex, rape, and extreme violence are other areas viewers won't find on American television. It is possible, however, to rent or buy videos of animated films that delve into these topics in graphic detail. These excerpts are from the Japanese anime piece entitled Legend of the Overfiend. As in American animation, not all Japanese anime has violent or sexual content, as this film does. In this particular case, violence is an integral part of the storyline.
Don Duga and I have been joined by our guest panelist, John O'Donnell, Managing Director of Central Park Media, and Candy Kugel, Director and Producer at Buzzco Associates Incorporated. Let me first ask the question about censorship. Don brought it up in our earlier conversation. You import Japanese films. We saw an example of that, an almost embarrassing example, as a matter of fact. Are you faced with censorship in importing these films from Japan, for these animation from Japan?
There's, of course, certain levels of censorship that any company has to follow. America is very strict, for example, with anything regarding underage children. So in no event would any participant in the Japanese animation industry import any kind of a cartoon that would look like it might have children under the age of 18 as in sexual law instances.
It depends upon where it's shown, and obviously, is it not? That is the time period in which this is to be seen?
Well, once you get over the basic obscenity laws or pornography laws in America, then censorship is a function of the venue. For example, a theatrical theater has a different rating than a television broadcast. Television broadcasts differ by Saturday morning compared to late night. Most of the Japanese animation available in America today is available on video cassette. So our
That's a new market, I imagine.
Very new market. Well, because of the growth of VCRs in the 80s, by the end of the 80s, the video cassette market by itself was sufficient to justify importing videos which in Japan may have been aired on television, may have been released theatrically. We put them on video for the audience here in America.
The matter of distribution's changed a great deal, has it not? I mean, you mentioned Mr. Magoo as a theatrical. It was limited to a very short piece in the theaters, and those short pieces, I suspect, haven't had much of a market in television, have they?
Well, actually, we do short animated pieces, and they often get licensed by cable stations, by PBS, and they also get theatrical distribution by the Tourneys of Animation and the Festivals of Animation, which are both kind of popular compilations of short films.
So there's still a market for the short animated film?
Definitely, and in film festivals they often show short films along with features and in their own programs. So although it's not as wide an audience as we would like to have for our own films, there's still an audience.
We were talking earlier about the fact that to appeal to a broad audience, you had to appeal both to the child's imagination as well as the adult who looks for something more sophisticated. And so many of the successful things over the years, Bullwinkle, I think of, as when I was growing up, maybe much later, I suppose, parents talked about Bullwinkle as well as kids talking about Bullwinkle, didn't they? It was a matter of sophisticated story.
Simpsons are the same way. It can appeal to both children and adults. And Sesame Street, frankly, in a lot of ways, even though it's for a preschool audience, they always kept in mind that they wanted the adults to be able to
I've
sit
had
there.
some connection with that, so I know that they've discovered early on that a child learns more if a parent is present, and they consciously write adult humor into that in order to get the parent present at the television set. I suspect even in business this is important, is it not, to get both the wider audience, both in the theater and in television?
Again, it's a function of what distribution channel you're looking at. Anything on television aims at a very broad market, and you want to bring in as many people as possible. When you're dealing with video, however, you're with a specialty market, and you're capable of delivering products specifically by age group. For example, we in the Japanese animation industry generally will label our titles so it's very clear to the store whether it's appropriate for children, whether it's appropriate for the high school audience, or whether it's appropriate for only those people over 18. So I think that you do have a different kind of flexibility based on how you're bringing the program to the market.
Is there any relationship between this kind of animation and comic books that were so popular some years back? Did the animation that we're talking about come out of comic books necessarily?
I think there's a great influence
Is
there.
there?
But yeah,
Well, Matt Groening, I guess, was
Yeah.
a comic book artist, was he not? Before
Strip
the
artist,
Simpsons
anyway.
were developed?
Japanese animation is heavily derived from Japanese comic books. Basically, the most popular comic books are those which are turned into animated programs for television, for primetime audience, what are called OVAs, original video animations, what we would call direct-to-video, and many theatrical releases. A good-selling comic book in Japan will do 4.5 million copies a week. That is astounding. That's 20 times higher than an American monthly level, which would be considered a good success. 40% of all books and periodicals sold in Japan are comic books.
It's true in Europe. The bande dessinée in France is just as popular as a regular kind of paperback novel. You see grown-ups reading comic books, and it's made for the adult audience in Europe much more frequently than you do here. Animation in Europe was always a very good propaganda device, especially in Eastern Europe, where there were certain things that they absolutely could not write about. When they were trying to make some kind of commentary on the government, they found that they could do it through both animation and comic books the way you couldn't in serious work. The only thing close to it right now is Mouse by Art Spiegelman here, which talks about a very serious subject in cartoon form.
I think Boss Tweed once said about the newspapers, I don't care what you write about because my voters can't read, but they can look at pictures. Right?
Is it silly to ask what the appeal is in animation for adults who can read?
Sure.
Interesting things to look at. Just because you can literally understand how a story is told, if a comic book or a cartoon can also tell the story in an interesting visual way, you're not just having talking heads like we have here. There may be real
talking
appeal.
heads.
That's right.
Well, what about the Cartoon Network? Has that opened up a new market for you? A full network filled with animated cartoons?
It's definitely a move in the right direction. As a matter of fact, more than half of the viewers of the Cartoon Network are 18 years or older. Mm-hmm. So it's just as good for the younger kids to see basically our animated culture at work, as it is for the older people to have a great way to enjoy a lot of their favorites from the past and new favorites coming out now.
What kind of content is there on the Cartoon Network? I should know.
It's mostly acquired work right now.
Is it for mostly aimed at kids, or?
Well, it's
Yes.
acquired series from Hanna-Barbera, basically, because that's where they came from, and now Warner Brothers, since they merged. So it is old.
It would be aimed at the broad audience suitable for the family.
Well, they did the 48 new pieces, though, and there was an attempt, and so I think there was a kind of hope that something's going to happen and the world's going to go someplace that it would be able to have an outlet for
New animation.
New animation, yeah. Because this has been one of the big problems, because back in the 60s, I was involved in doing independent animation, and we used to show them in little movie houses, and there was nothing on television, and so but there were still people making that. Now that there's this kind of distribution, and with the Cartoon Network, I think there's great hope that there will be outlets for a lot of different kind of animation that nobody was able ever to see before.
And
Yeah, I mean, they just had a whole thing about the Canadian independence. They did a series there, and last year they showed a few independent animated films as part of their independent animation thing, which they showed our last film in, so hey.
Right.
I think what you're witnessing is a generational change. People of my generation, people in their 40s and 50s now, tend to have grown up thinking animation is for children. The newer generation, the MTV generation, if you will, Generation Y, X, whatever we're calling them, has grown up with a visually oriented culture that is expressed in short segment spans, such as what you see on MTV. USA Today factoids would be an example. It is short bites of intense visual material, video game based in many cases. They're looking at a new kind of visual literacy, and as a result they're growing up accepting what Europeans have known all along, Japanese have known all along, that animation per se can be for any audience. It's merely a media, it's merely a format. It's the content of a specific animation which directs as to whether it's for just children plus the broad range market, or only for adults.
Actually, MTV, you were asking how it got back to the adult audience. In, I guess it was the late 60s and most of the 70s, after David Ogilvy announced that animation was a cheap way of doing advertising, and it was only for kids, it just shouldn't be done. When MTV came around in 1980 and they were looking for something new and eye-popping because animation wasn't being used anymore, they started to bring in a whole new animation with all of their station break, their logo and everything else, which then opened the way for animation to become popular again.
I gather that animation has an almost unlimited life. I mean, that
Absolutely.
you can. There's not a manner of dress that dates it at all.
Yeah.
I would expect to see Felix the Cat any day now upon the Cartoon Network, and that goes way, way back in my own memory.
Like any painting or things like that, it becomes either camp or nostalgic, but there's nothing to date it per se.
Good art always survives. Casablanca, for example, Gone with the Wind. When Gone with the Wind first came, of course, it was 100 years old because it was about the Civil War, but we're still watching it today and probably will be 100 years from now.
I don't want to pick on the Simpsons, but is that good art?
Yes.
Yellow faces and blue hair?
It expresses very clearly the emotion, the story, and the character developments, and so in that case it's successful.
It has an integrity to it. Its writing and its look.
Some of the best writing.
Very coherent.
Yes.
Some of the best writing in animation is done on The Simpsons. It's very well done. If you really
as well written as the Bullwinkle Show.
Yes, that's what I gather. We're going to pause here for a moment and look at another example of the animated genre, this time with humor in situations geared toward an adult audience.
In recent decades, animation has experienced a renaissance in production and a renewal of its lost prestige. During the mid-'80s, a select number of animated programs made their way into morning and afternoon slots. An unsung hero of this revival was Robotech, which was released in the U.S. in 1985. To all outward appearances, the program seemed to resemble the usual giant robot formula normally imported from Japan. The formula actually took a back seat to the astonishing development of the characters in the series. In 1988, animation marched its way onto primetime television with The Simpsons, created by Matt Groening. The program successfully reinstated the tradition of visual gags coupled with on-target social critique that hadn't been seen in the mainstream since the 1950s. After The Simpsons, other animated programs invaded the primetime domain once thought inaccessible by such programs as the controversial Beavis and Butthead,
Hey guys, different
Duckman,
classes. This thing is genius.
Ren and Stimpy, The Tick, and most recently, King of the Hill, created by Mike Judge, whose previous show, Beavis and Butthead, had made him a household name.
Butthead porn!
Some viewers may still condemn these programs as juvenile, and even as derogatory, but no one can deny that animation has re-established itself as an art form for all ages.
Fix my dinner.
I'm afraid we've run out of time for this animated discussion, so my thanks to Don Duga, John O'Donnell, and Candy Kugel. And now, this last word. The art of animation, and it is an art, has grown up in the years since World War II. It's become more sophisticated, not just Felix the Cat and Terry Toons anymore, but high-tech renderings of complex ideas. And as a personal note, before we go overboard on its wonders, this mild demur. The reservation of someone old enough to remember a time before 1937. That's when Disney's Snow White etched forever into our consciousness his image of Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Until then, these characters from children's literature existed only in the vivid screen of the child's own imagination. Animation has largely co-opted that screen, substituting its own admittedly engaging images. Is it too much to hope that parents will take note and take steps to protect and nurture in their brood that liveliest of all theaters, the child's theater of imagination? I'm James Day for WorldCom. See you next time.